Hello, I'm Mike Lyons, your host for another oral history interview for the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association. The association's purpose is to preserve the rich history and contribution of the area's radio, television, and broadcasting industries. The association is open to those past and present broadcasters and those affiliated with the region's broadcasting industry and entities who have served this region's proud broadcasting heritage. We welcome students who are focusing their careers on the broadcasting industry. Our guest today for our oral history is Sam Kouvaris. Sam, a longtime sportscaster here at Channel 4.
Do your viewers know that nobody calls you Mike? That everybody calls you Bubba?
Do they know that? So a lot of people
nobody calls him Mike or Michael, ever. Right. Never heard anybody say that.
Bubba. So, well, I called everybody that, and then I got the name.
And that's right.
I've interviewed a few former broadcasters recently and found that they never intended to be in broadcasting.
Absolutely.
And that was sort of the case for you. How did you get into broadcasting?
I was a pre-med student at Clemson, and I had every intention of going to medical school. And halfway through my freshman year, my second semester, they called all the pre-med students in and said, we're getting rid of the pre-med program here because it became kind of an engineering school. And they said, but 51% of the people who get into med school didn't get pre-med majors. And I thought to myself, that means 49% did. So I switched my major to political science, and I took an elective in the second half of that year called Introduction to Broadcasting. And about halfway through, the professor pulled me aside and said, I've taught this for a long time, and you have a pretty good aptitude for it. You might want to consider it. And I said, well, I'm transferring at some point. He gave me a list of 7 schools. Maryland was one of them, still had a broadcasting department. And I transferred to Maryland because I had in-state status there and got my degree in radio, television, and film, and had every intention of being a director, and that's what my degree is in, directing,
Really?
And so, I walk into the booth and I understand all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I tried to get a job for a while. I had the only job that mimicked what I wanted to do, and that was I was bartending in D.C., same hours, basically. And so I just was trying to get into directing, and finally one of the directors, Ernie Bauer, who I ran into at a Redskins game a couple of years ago, said to me, it's such a closed field because it's so dominated by unions and guys who have these jobs and so forth. If you want to get into TV, being on television is where they'll hire you. I mean, if you're an axe murderer, they'll hire you. And I said, really? So Bobby Lynch, who was a director at Channel 5, because the bar I was working in was kind of in the shadow of the towers of Channel 9 and Channel 5, let me come in on a Sunday night, write some scripts, and I stood there and did a sportscast, and he came down from the booth, and he looked at me and he said, you really want to do this? And I said, yeah, what do you mean? He goes, everybody I talked to, it was the era of Warner Wolf in D.C. Everybody I talked to wants to be a sportscaster. And I was like, well, I kind of would like to stay close to the games, and they pretty much told me I couldn't. I played football and baseball at Clemson. They told me I couldn't play anymore. So so he said, well, I tell you what, I'm going to go back up. You start again, and when you talk about Frank Robinson, I'll roll this tape, and you talk about that, and when you talk about this, I'll roll this other tape. And I took that tape, put it under my arm, started driving south, cold calling. I got to Charleston, South Carolina about a week later. I'd been thrown out of about 25 television stations, in Wilmington and Richmond and Florence and places like that. I walked into Channel 5 at 9 o'clock, and the guy said, I'd made an appointment with him the night before, and he said, I like your tape, but I have a guy. It turned out to be Warren Pepper, who remains a very close friend of mine who's been in Charleston forever. I went to the NBC at 11 o'clock, and I made an appointment, and the guy said, I like your tape, but I have a guy. In fact, I hired him from the ABC. You might want to talk to them. Who I had an appointment with at 1 o'clock, and I went in to see their news director, Tom Allen. He interviewed me at 1, he hired me at 3, and he put me on the air at 6 o'clock that night.
Wow.
So it's, whenever I speak to groups and I tell students, and obviously you're inviting students, I tell them, look, being there is 90% of the equation. And you know this, being a reporter and an anchor for as long as you were. Being there, it gives you the nuance, and you see things and you understand things more than just reading about it or watching it on TV. So that's part of it. And there's a level of persistence, I guess, that's involved, because I got my job here in Jacksonville the same way. Three years in Charleston, and the job at Channel 4 was posted in Broadcasting Magazine, which is a trade journal. And I got no response when I sent the tape to Steve Wasserman. So I drove down here after the Heritage golf tournament in 1981. And I was waiting for him when he came to work at 8 o'clock. He came to the door and he said to me, do we have an appointment? And I said, no. He said, yeah, I don't think I made appointments at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. And he started to close the door. I literally, like the old Fuller Brush man, stuck my foot in the door and said, hey, I'm working in Charleston. I can be on the air at 6 o'clock. I just want 5 minutes of your time and I'll leave you alone. So I went into his office and he kind of reluctantly saw me. He had 300 tapes there. You know, sunshine sells for sportscasters. You know, a lot of people wanted to work in Jacksonville. And I didn't like him and he didn't like me. But when I went back, you know, I sent him another tape because he said, you know, your tape is kind of vanilla. And I said, you know, you news directors, when you send out this all call, you don't say what you're looking for. I'm just showing you that I can go on TV and do this. And so I sent him a thank you note and a new tape. And 6 weeks later, he called me back for a formal interview. And 6 weeks after that, they ended up hiring me.
Wow. I don't picture you ever being intimidated, but you're a young guy, and you got hired in the afternoon, and you were on the air at 6. And what was that like?
Petrified. I mean, petrified.
You had to be.
I mean, it was just unbelievable. And I remember going to bed that night, Friday night, after being on the air, and you probably remember this early in your career, and waking up and thinking, next week I'll have been on television a week. Right? And then 40 years later, I was on every night. But it's funny how, you know, the rhythms of your body change in terms of, I can still tell, even though I've been out now for 14 months, I can still tell at 6 o'clock, that adrenaline still kind of kicks in for me a little bit. I get very focused. If they ever move the river run to 6 p.m., I'll run my PR.
I bet. So you work in Charleston. That's a small market. You come to Jacksonville. How was Jacksonville, working in Jacksonville, different than in Charleston? And not only that, you came to Channel 4, which is a pretty heavy-duty news station.
And at the time, Channel 4 was a powerhouse in the Southeast. And the reason was because Katharine Graham was alive. It was owned by the Washington Post Company. It was Philip Graham's favorite television station, according to Post-Newsweek lore at the time. And at the time, they owned stations in Miami and Orlando. Well, they didn't own Orlando at the time, but eventually bought Orlando. So had a big presence in Florida. And at the time, Channel 4 was very competitive on a national scale. When you came to work at Channel 4, it was kind of controversial because it was only my second job. Channel 4, and you remember this, that Channel 4, it was your third or fourth job when you came to work there. People with a lot of experience. People, you know, Ernie Mastriani was doing a lot of investigative stuff, and of course Tom Wills was a fixture right after Bill Grove.
When I came here, Steve Croft was at
Steve Croft, exactly. I mean, you know, people like that. Mike Patrick had my job before me. So it was a little controversial that they hired me as only my second job. And the other two candidates, one was doing weekends in Denver, and they didn't hire him, and another guy was somewhere in San Francisco. So for me to come from a small market to Jacksonville, which still wasn't considered a very large market, it was in the 60s at the time. Charleston was 120 or 130, depending on who was watching in Beaufort. If Beaufort was watching Charleston, we were 120. If Beaufort was watching Savannah, we were 130. But it was very, very kind of different. Bigger television station, felt more professional. Full-time photography staff at the time, really dedicated to journalism and doing a lot of the right things. And that's back when people really paid attention and
You had
watched.
to feel like you fell into some great soup, didn't you?
Well, I did, and certainly, I mean, and then over the years, I realized that, you know, Tom and Deborah and George and I working together for so long was so unique, and I always felt greatly supported by, at the time, the management and the people I worked with, and that was kind of unique because, as you know, in TV you can eventually kind of be kind of a loner, kind of just out there doing your job, but being supported by the people that you worked for and the people that were around you was very important.
What was your philosophy of sports reporting and local sports reporting? How did you approach your job, your philosophy, I guess I would say?
I talked to a guy about a year ago, and he said, "Tell me how you got into it." And I said, "Well, you know, I told him the story that I told you earlier, and he said, well, of course. He said, I said, I always liked the journalism of it. I like the staying close to athletes, the finding out what made them tick, telling the truth, good or bad, all the time. I said, I really like that. And he said to me, yeah, he said, you got into it after Watergate. Reporting was a very noble profession at the time. And I said, yeah, I said, it was weird. The unintended consequence was I became a celebrity. I said, I never kind of intended that because I just liked the journalism. I just liked being a journalist. And he said, that's funny because, since 1995, everybody I've interviewed who wants to be on TV just wants to be on TV.
Yeah.
And I said, so if you just want to be a celebrity, I guess the unintended consequence is you don't become a journalist. And he just laughed. But I always liked the storytelling. I liked the people involved. And through the 40 years that I was in television, I was always inspired by the people that I actually reported on. Because from the 4-year-old rhythmic gymnast to the grizzled NFL veteran, and you experienced this, those people who reach those heights are always trying to find out how good they can be. They're not particularly worried about the score, winning or losing. They want to see how far they can push themselves, how good they can be. And that inspired me to try to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And then you sort of ended up being a part of history in a way with the anchor team there at Channel 4. That's kind of amazing how long
it sounds
y'all were
impressive
together.
that Tom and George and Deborah and I were the longest running 4-person anchor team in the history of television, until you realize that TV's only 65 years old. It's not like it went back to the 1600s. But
you were together.
We were together for 21, 22 years before Deborah retired from TV in 2002. So it was quite a run. A lot of anchor teams have been together, but not 4 people like that staying together and staying in the same town. And I credit the management at the time there, when Katharine Graham was alive, and the presidents of the company that we had at the time were very committed to making sure that as a television station we had the right equipment. I mean, you were our competitor, We always had the right equipment, we sent the right people, we covered the right things. Right. We didn't skimp. We knew if we did a really good job, the money would follow. Of course, the business has changed dramatically since then, but that was an important part of what we were doing.
Mm-hmm. You talk about working with those guys for so long, those people. Let's talk about Tom Wills. I mean, you worked with him a long time. Tom's a great guy.
Sure.
I worked at 4, for about 5 years on the
Exactly.
assignment desk. He was one of my favorite people there.
Sure. And probably because he sees things in a very practical and fair way. I've always thought. I mean, one time a reporter wrote that it was ironic that somebody was killed in this accident, and Tom said to the reporter, "There's no irony in death," and those are the kinds of things that you don't get that out of a book. A guy like Tom with life experiences can only bring that to a newsroom and kind of hold it together. And I think the longer you work with somebody like that, and particularly with Tom, you recognize the depth of their personality, the depth of their experience, and what they bring to every story that they do. I happen to know that, and you know this too, Tom rewrites all of his scripts. For those of you who don't know, producers write the scripts, right? Assignment editors write the scripts sometimes. Tom rewrites every script because there's a certain depth and a history that he can bring to every story that you just don't find in anybody else.
Right. Deborah Gianolis.
Tom used to describe the two of them as salt and pepper. Deborah was the spice of what was going on. Also somebody who was a tremendous journalist and a tremendous on-air talent. And that, you need that. She had that natural ability, and you see it, in people. Some people just have that it factor on TV, and certainly she had it. And Bubba, you remember in the 80s, all anybody talked about was Deborah's haircut, right?
Yeah.
I mean, where'd she get her? I mean, every day somebody would ask me where. So, she was an excellent journalist, had a lot of compassion, a lot of empathy for particular causes, and that continued after her retirement in television. But a real on-air talent that brought a spark to the 4 of us.
Mm-hmm. George Winterling.
George was so into the weather that it was an insult to call him a weatherman. I mean, he is, to this day, a true meteorologist, a guy who loved to study the weather, you know, who really understood why it was happening. Obviously got a level of credibility by predicting that Dora would come here, but in '64, but just one of those people that if you went into George's office at any time, he wasn't staring at the ceiling or watching. We might have been watching Florida State because his son coached there for a while,
Yeah.
right? But he was working on the weather. I mean, and he was trying to figure it out. It's before all the current, you know, apps that you can have and all this. I mean, George really understood the weather and loved it, and I thought that came through on the air, that he was telling you about what was going on as your neighbor. Hey, here's what's going to happen. Not just some comedian or distant guy or whatever who was looking for the next job. He was very interested in doing that.
And working with those three had to make you a better broadcaster.
Well, you better bring your A game or you're going to look stupid. I mean, they're bringing their A game every day, so you better figure it out. And I, you know, it took me a while to kind of figure it out. Tom certainly helped me. Deborah helped me. Watching George certainly helped me. But in 1983, and you did this early in your career, and a lot of people will do this in their careers. You know, I was watching tapes of myself, and I felt like I had almost a stilted kind of hackneyed kind of presentation. But when I did the shows in the field, did live shots, I felt like that it really revealed my personality and kind of what I thought. So I said to the three directors, Chris Hesley and Mal Reddington, who I went to Maryland with, I said to them, look, I'm going to stop writing scripts. I'm going to give you a rundown, and I'll give you an outline of the show, and I'm just going to ad-lib the show. Put a lot of pressure on me. And I said to them, the pressure on you is no longer will you have to read the script, you're just going to have to listen and figure out when I'm... And exactly, they'd ad-lib their job. And because of not only their kindness, but their talent, we were able to do that. I stopped writing scripts in 1983 and never wrote another script, unless it was a legal story that I felt like I had to get it exactly right. But I never wrote another script after 1983.
From your seat as a broadcaster here, how have you seen Jacksonville change over the years when you came here?
Oh, it's unbelievable. And you know, and in the 37 years I worked at Channel 4 at the time, you know, was a very, like I said, a powerhouse and very influential. Really worked specifically with Tommy Hazouri's administration to get rid of tolls. You know, that was a big thing. Did a couple of award-winning documentaries called The Smell of Money that helped clean up the air in Jacksonville in terms of paper plant and chemical plant. And those two things really changed people's perception. Think about a generation before the current generation that drove through Jacksonville. We were always known as the city with tolls on 95 and the city that stinks. And once that disappeared, the town kind of exploded. And, you know, that's part of it. I think that there's been a kind of a lack of leadership in city government that can take us to the next level. I'm hoping that happens sometime soon. You know, but the problem is that the pension, the city didn't have any money, basically, let's put it that way, because the pension was dragging it down. Now that they've figured that out, I would anticipate Jacksonville exploding as a town once again, as a place. You know, there's a lot of people in South Florida who ask me, what's it like up there? You know, because, you know, we've got some wide open spaces, you know, we've got some beautiful beaches, we get different seasons. I mean, I had no intention of staying here when I came here. I figured I'd be here 3 years, I'd be in Tampa or Atlanta or something like that. I actually got offered the job with the television station down in Miami after 3 years here. But my wife Linda and I just decided we wanted to raise our children here, and it was the best decision ever.
Right. A lot of Jaguars do the same, and that was
ex-military, ex-Navy guys and Jaguars, coaches, players, everybody lives here.
Right.
Once they come here, they're like, "Don't tell anybody." You know? Yeah. It's kind of a secret. Yeah. You know?
That was my next question. The Jaguars and the NFL, big part of your broadcasting career, and even you were reporting it the night they got the team.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
one
just
of the two my two favorite stories, in fact, that I did in my 40 years was being there, and I was fortunate enough to know Tom Petway and David Selden and Ron Weaver and Wayne and Dolores. And I was literally inside the room when they found out they were getting a team. And I was the only reporter in there, much to
Hiding
Gene.
yourself behind a paper, were you? So
Actually,
they didn't throw you out?
behind the plans.
So they wouldn't throw you out.
HOK, thank you to HOK who helped design the stadium. I held the plans up in front of me when the security guard went around, and Tom Petway was sitting next to me, and all he did was look over and laugh. And I put the plans down, and they threw everybody out, and Gene Fournette was yelling, "The Kouvaris is still in there!" But you know, it's a competitive business. You know that.
Right.
I didn't feel bad. I wasn't hurting anybody.
Right.
But you know, so that was funny, and basically, you know, the Jaguars put Jacksonville on the map, that people know who we are and where we are now. It'd be great if they were any good. The first 5 years, it was a kind of a different story. But if they ever became good, I think it would considerably help that in terms of the town. And Shad Khan is transformed. I thought the best comment about Shad when he bought the team was Wayne Weaver handed the baton to a faster runner. I mean, Wayne Weaver was a phenomenal. He's the only reason we got a team, and you know that.
Right.
I mean, he's the only reason. He was
Only one.
popular among the other owners, and that's a fraternity, plain and simple. Plain and simple. At the time, it was 28 guys. I got dragged into a meeting once because I was wearing a coat and tie and was from Jacksonville, and I'm standing there, and Hugh Culverhouse has got his feet up on the table with his general manager. There were 28 owners and 28 GMs in there, so there's 56 guys in there. They're smoking cigars, they're telling jokes, they're talking about sports, women, you know, the normal stuff. It's a fraternity, right? Wayne Weaver showed up against Boogie Wineglass, the Glazers, an indiscriminate group from St. Louis, and he's such a good guy and such a popular guy. Plus he had the skills at the time, marketing skills. He had done work in Brazil and in South America, where the league was very interested in his international ideas that he had with Nine West. And so, I mean, he's the only reason. If we had anybody else as our front guy, the team would have been in St. Louis.
And having the Jaguars NFL really another reason probably kept you here as well. I mean,
Yeah.
just
In fact, Bubba, the only time I ever thought about leaving was 1990. And if you remember, in 1990, there was a group of people in town who didn't want to give up their influence, and they helped kill the entire situation with us trying to get a team. And Linda and I said, look, if the people who are kind of running the city are going to be so small-minded that they don't realize what an NFL team could do for the city, then it's not where we want to live. And luckily, Don Davis is another reason Don Davis is the answer, you know, because the thing was dead. Wayne was out. Nobody was going to do anything. And
it was irritating.
it was terrible. And Don Davis and Roger Goodell, who was an assistant with the league, who probably was the most influential person in the league about us getting a team at the time under Paul Tagliabue, Don Davis met with Ed Austin on the beach out at Jack's Beach, and they talked about how to revive this thing, and it got going. It was before Wayne got involved, but I mean, everybody was out and the thing was over, and he revived it and kept it going.
Mm-hmm. You've seen a lot of changes in broadcasting in Jacksonville City. What would you say the big changes in broadcasting over the 40 years that you were doing it?
Technologically, it's hard to describe it other than, you know, revolutionary. And it changed the dynamic. If you remember, you know, in the 70s, there were fixed satellites, and it was the microwave, which is a line of sight. We had microwave trucks. A line of sight broadcast were the only two ways you could get outside of the studio. And so for years, when I would do a live shot from a game here, a game there, I'd have to go find a television station that had a fixed satellite in order to broadcast it back to Jacksonville. Then we went to these, you know, satellites on trucks, satellite trucks, is what we called them forever. And now you can do I did a live shot from London from backpack technology that is 10 cell phone lines in a thing about that big.
Yeah.
That's able to scramble your voice, scramble your picture, send it back to the television station where it's descrambled, and put it on the air, and all it takes is that and a cell signal. So virtually anywhere in the world that has cellular service, you can do a live shot for virtually nothing.
And do a lot more, do it a lot faster.
A lot faster, a lot more. You know, it used to be that we brought tapes back and we worked on the tapes, but if it was an important story, you had to share the tape with other departments and other things. Now, you bring it back on the card, you dump it into the system, and everybody has access to it instantly. So everything obviously, just like, there's 250,000 times the computing power in your phone as there was on the LEM that landed on the moon. So it's kind of along the same lines. There's so many things you can do in television now that you couldn't before.
You were a sportscaster for a long time, but
Right.
you got into being a news anchor.
Yeah.
Kind of took Tom's place when he was gone.
Yeah.
How'd you like that?
I liked it a lot more than I thought I would. And I really, I thought that was going to be the arc of my career, but the current management came in and changed that. Since they came in, I never anchored another day. But Maureen Ruddy, Mo Ruddy, who in fact is runs a department here at UNF, and was our news director. And Larry Blackerby was the general manager who recently retired. And they came to me and said, where do you think you'll be in 5 years? And I said, what do you care? You're not going to be here. Because, the average stay of a news director is like 2.5 years. Tom used to call Deborah, George, and I the permanent government. Right? That's what he used to call
That's
it.
good.
That's kind of an inside joke. But it's the impact that you can have from that chair is so dramatic, and particularly back when people used to watch TV and particularly watch local news before cable, certainly before the internet. The impact that you could have. My wife also said that I look like a movie star sitting there because the lighting is perfect. You've sat in the anchor chair. You're like, where'd this lighting come from? This lighting's perfect.
Yeah.
So, but when you sit there, the impact that you can have on the people you're talking to and also the people you're working with, so often, and they assigned me as Tom's permanent replacement. For those people who are old enough, I was Joan Rivers, right? Every time Johnny was gone,
Right.
Joan was. Every time Tom was gone, Sam was anchoring, and I really enjoyed it. And as I said, I thought that would be the arc of my career. But the current management there, decided that wasn't going to be the answer, and hired Kent Justice, who's a fine guy and a good broadcaster. But it's funny how the anchor. It becomes the face of the franchise kind of immediately. And at the same time, when young reporters would come in, and as I said about Tom Wills earlier, they would write things that had a point of view. And so I went to Maureen, Mo Ruddy, and I said, I think you need to pick somebody else for this job because all these reporters have have this idea that what they think about a story is the story. And she said, what do you mean? And I told her, and I said, you need to have a meeting and explain to them that journalism is getting the facts and presenting them to the people so they can make up their own minds. And she waved me off and said, they'd have no idea what you were talking about. I said, what? She said, oh yeah, that's pretty much what they're taught in school, that, we're going to change the world. We're going to, and I understood that part. And she said, that's why I picked you, because I want you to change it. And I looked at her and I said, be careful what you wish for here. So I like to think that in the time that I was anchoring, much like Tom does, I tried to bring those stories to the center, present it to people, give them the information, let them make up their own minds.
State of the national news must be driving you nuts.
Well, and it's funny because you watch different cable broadcasts these days, and if you remember, Fox came on the air in 1998. Everybody else had done the news the same way, whether it was CBS, NBC, ABC, the Dumont Network,
CNN.
Eventually CNN,
Yeah.
people like that. Everybody did the news the same way. Fox came on and gave a different perspective, went from non-existent to #1 in 1 year. Took them 1 year. It's not because of their political bent. It's because there was an audience out there that felt like that their needs weren't being serviced. So that became their go-to. What happened then was the other stations got mad. And so they started yelling about Fox and people like them, and they moved a little further on the political spectrum, which forced Fox to move further this way on the political spectrum, to the point where they're just standing in opposite corners yelling at each other, which, as you know, creates a void in the middle that I think somebody's going to fill. And to me, that's what's missing certainly in American broadcasting. You know, you look around the world, the BBC is somewhat left. Al Jazeera is actually kind of in the middle. But you look at world broadcasting, and we get a lot of it on our cable now. You know, American broadcasters have really retreated to both corners of the political spectrum, and there's a void there in the middle that I think people are looking for.
So there came a time, I guess in 2019, or maybe it was before that, that you parted ways with Channel
2018.
4. I guess part of the business, part of the broadcasting business, sort of like the business part of the NFL that you report on all the time.
But nobody knows what happened to me better than professional athletes. You know, I mean, my contract ended, and they didn't really offer me a contract that my agent and I thought was suitable. And they didn't want me to anchor the sports any longer. You know, they just wanted me to do a few things for a very small percentage of what I was making, and we never could come to an agreement. And I thought it was a negotiating ploy on their part because, as you know, when you negotiate a contract, they start at A, you start at Z, and eventually you're going to meet at L, M, or N, right? Somewhere in there, right? Yeah. Well, they never came off of A, and I was willing to kind of do a lot of different things, but it was pretty clear that they wanted to move on, and as the press release said, we both agreed that it was time, and technically it was time based on the fact that, you know, they, and since then, don't have, the job that I had doesn't exist any longer. I was the sports director, and that's no longer a job, and that's no longer a job in much of the Graham media television stations, and it's no longer a job a lot in local television. You know, the sports departments are being kind of folded into the news departments at large, and part of that is because a new generation of news leadership comes in. They think sports is covered by ESPN, and I would say to these new news directors, very similar to how the weather is covered by the Weather Channel. Because it is. And of course, all they would do is get mad about that. They'd go, no. You think ESPN is going to cover what's going on at Jackson High School when they've got a kid going to the University of Florida? No, they're not going to cover that. You know, they're going to
top draft picks.
Top draft picks. You know, I mean, all the things that, you know. There's a giant spectrum of things you can cover in sports that affect the people in your community, and there's two sides to that. One is the competitive aspect of it, because people are sports fans. I used to say very often, what other subject are we going to talk about on the news are people willing to get in a fist fight about? Right? Yeah. There's maybe one or two, but almost everything in sports, you know, people are very passionate about and want to hear that, and want to hear it from a fair perspective. Right. So, you know, that's dramatically changed, and I don't think it'll ever go back.
A lot of people started in print journalism and moved to broadcasting. David Lamb, Frank Frangie, a couple I think about. Sure. Now you were in broadcasting and you've gone to the print. Yeah. That's a turnaround.
I was very flattered when Mary Kelly Palka and Joe DeSalvo called me as soon as my departure from Channel 4 was official, and
from the Times Union, let us say that,
and then from the Times Union, the editor and special projects, and I've known Joe forever, and asked me if I would be willing to write a Sunday column, and it keeps me in the business, and I thought it was really interesting, Bubba, because I was on television for 40 years, and as I said, the unintended consequence was I became a celebrity, and people would come up to me in restaurants, and generally over that time, people were very nice to me, very kind to me over the years. A couple of people, you know, you've been in that situation, you know, but 99% of the time, people couldn't be nicer and couldn't be more flattering and couldn't be better to you. And a friend of mine said, I think you'll find as a writer that, he said, I know this is for me. I know those people on TV, and I occasionally see them out. I have a much more intimate relationship with somebody who writes a column, and that turned out to be very true. I'll get emails, very thoughtful, very, very kind emails from people who talk about my writing, and a sentence that I wrote that really resonated with them, reminded them of their dad, or whatever. I mean, just those kinds of things that you can't get by being a broadcaster, because what you do as a broadcaster goes out there and then it goes into the ether. Yeah. That newspaper article, even though people don't read newspapers anymore, online and sometimes physically, lives on for weeks and sometimes forever.
What advice would you give to young people that want to get into the broadcasting business? You talked a little bit about it earlier. What would you say to them?
It's not about being a celebrity. It's about being passionate about the people and the things you want to talk about. I know when you're in your 20s, you're out to change the world. But as a journalist, it's your job to kind of discern what's actually going on here. If it's a controversy, what's happening on both sides, not just one side. What's actually happening here, and let people make up their own minds. And every intern that came in to Channel 2 in Charleston and Channel 4 here in Jacksonville, when they would come in, or people I would interview, the last question I would ask them literally as they were walking out the door, I'd wait, and I'd say, "Hey, by the way, what do you want to be?" And they would always hesitate. And I would always say, "You can say you want my job. It's okay. You can't have it right now, but you can say you want my job right now." And people would always say, "Yeah, I want to be you." And by the time their internship was over, almost all of them would say, "I want to be anybody but you." Because as you know, there's 35, 50 different jobs in a newsroom. And all of them have a specific skill set in order for it to work properly. And you were able to fill so many different ones of those. You were an anchor, reporter, photographer, assignment desk. I mean, you did a producer, you did so many different things. You saw how different those jobs really are. So if you want to be in broadcasting or in journalism, find that part of the business that really suits you, because then it'll never feel like you're going to work a day in your life. Because if you force yourself, I absolutely have to be an anchor, I have to be a reporter, maybe you're a better writer, maybe a producer is a better. I mean, Kevin Talley, who worked with me for the 29 years at Channel 4, went into television thinking he was going to be an on-air weekend guy in North Carolina. Turns out he's the best producer ever. I mean, he's a wonderful writer. He's a great photographer. He has got a beautiful eye for editing. Same thing with Matt Kingston. Two guys that I leaned on and worked closely with. Matt Kingston is never really wanted to be on TV, but he wanted to be in TV because he could see the impact that it had. He's a beautiful photographer. Edits, thinks quickly, does so many different things, and consequently that's why he left TV and he's now the social media manager for the city of Jacksonville. Yeah.
So you do it all over again, you wouldn't be a doctor.
I probably would, yeah. And there's a lot of stupid things that I did, and there's a lot of things I'd like to take back that I said. But when you're on television that long and it's live, you're going to say all 7 of those words that you're not supposed to say. You're going to have to apologize to some people. But to really understand, I think, the impact that you can have as a member of your community from any one of those chairs is I think, the most important thing about doing that. It's not something you should take lightly because people are paying attention.
Right. It was great paying attention to you for so long, and a great job interview,
right.
And great that we still get to read your thoughts.
I'm really enjoying it. A lot of stupid stuff rolling around in my head still.
All right, Sam, thank you much.
Thank you.